Hello and welcome back to Season 8, Episode number 9 of the Everyday Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Green. This is a podcast where we remind ourselves that God deserves every praise from every creature every day. We are covering the book of Ecclesiastes this season. I hope that you've enjoyed it so far. And we're around a third of the way done or so. We're looking at chapter 5, verses 1 through 9 this week. This is the folly of false religion. Let's begin reading in verse number 1 of chapter 5. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. For high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. Pretty interesting stuff in this section. As I've said before, this season, I'm breaking down these sections mostly based on the Memphis School of Preaching lectures on the book of Ecclesiastes. I think it was 1993 or 94 or something like that. And this is an interesting section. Again, the title is The Folly of False Religion. Solomon in this text is dealing with one's approach to God, worship, outlook on life, fear of the Lord or lack thereof, etc. What we're going to see is the negative examples of those who do not have the proper attitude toward worship. Their outlook on life is incorrect, and they don't fear the Lord. And so Solomon rightly condemns that behavior in this text. So let's go back to verse number 1 and go through this verse by verse. Verse 1 says, Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. The King James Version here says, Keep thy foot. So walk prudently or keep thy foot when you go to the house of God. We might say, watch your step. The application is pretty obvious that Solomon is saying we need to be careful in worship. Incidentally, there are many people who say it doesn't really matter how you worship God, just worship Him in your own way. But the Bible clearly tells us that we must worship God in spirit and in truth. John 4, verse 24. And so we must worship God in the right way, according to truth, and also in the right way according to spirit, or our attitude, desiring to worship God correctly. We must respect the seriousness of the occasion. Reverence for worship is a very important topic. You can also read about reverence in the book of Malachi. I'll list one verse, Malachi 1, verse 8, says, And when you offer the blind as a sacrifice, is it not evil? And when you offer the lame and sick, is it not evil? Offer it then to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you favorably, says the Lord of hosts? And so back in that context of Malachi, the Jews at that time were very irreverent. They viewed worship as a weariness, as something to be dreaded, we might say. They weren't taking it seriously. Their worship and bringing their offerings was terrible. They were offering the blind and the sick as sacrifices, and God was not pleased at those sacrifices at all. I will say that people tend usually to go too far in one of two directions when it comes to the subject of reverence. On the one hand, reverence does not mean that you have to be stodgy or stoic or somber at all moments. that you can never have a smile on your face, or you can never express joy, or even have a humorous moment at times. Some I think have the idea that a preacher can never tell a joke in his sermon, and that's not right. The worship service as a whole is certainly a serious occasion, but it can be appropriate to have a little humor here and there. The worship service is not a funeral service as a whole. Now, I will say that there's one part of our worship service that is actually very similar to a funeral service, and that is when we partake of communion, when we partake of the Lord's Supper. It's very similar to a funeral service in the sense that we are doing that in remembrance of Jesus, in remembrance of his sacrifice that he made on our behalf. And we remember that it was our sins that put him on that cross. So we examine ourselves and we try to partake in a worthy manner. We're commanded to do so. And so that's a very serious moment in our worship service. You could definitely argue for a more somber atmosphere there in that part of our worship. And I think that it used to be said that when members of the church were partaking of the Lord's Supper, that you could hear a pin drop, so to speak, because it was so quiet and reflective of that sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf. We certainly would do well to continue to maintain that seriousness and even somberness when observing of the Lord's Supper. So reverence is certainly important there, and reverence throughout the worship service. That said, let's not go too far the other direction and say that it's never okay for a preacher to mention something humorous in his sermon, or, we should never smile. Well, when I'm singing about heaven, I'm smiling because I'm thinking about how wonderful that's going to be. So we just need to be careful with that when it comes to reverence. Reverence does mean that we treat worship with seriousness and respect for God. We don't treat worship flippantly or profanely, that is, making something out to be trivial that God says is very serious. Hebrews 12, verse 28 talks about serving God with reverence and godly fear. Verse number 29 goes on to talk about how our God is a consuming fire. And so if we think that God doesn't take our worship seriously, we need to think again, because he absolutely does. Just ask Nadab and Abihu, right? Leviticus 10, verses 1 and following. They offered strange fire before the Lord, and God brought the fire of heaven to consume them, killed them for their error there. There are some cultural things that come into play here, I think, when we consider, is this respectful? Would it be appropriate for me to wear this when I go to worship? Things like that. I think that there's some Romans 14 room for judgment in some matters, but we always need to err on the side of caution and make sure that we're doing our best to be reverent when we come and worship God. We should never be purposely or openly disrespectful to God or to one another in worship. I also think of Ephesians 5, verse 21. I think that's appropriate here. It says, submitting to one another in the fear of God. So quite a bit to say there about verse number 1, but let's go ahead and roll through some of the rest of these verses. Verse number 2, do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. Notice Solomon's reasoning for all of this. For God is in heaven and you on earth. I've got that underlined in my Bible. That is such an important thing for us to realize. When we think about how there is a God and we're not him, that should really dictate how we live our lives. We should think of ourselves in utmost humility compared to an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and all-present, omnipresent God that we serve. So let's think of ourselves in humility and think of ourselves in smallness, if you will, compared to, as the kids sometimes sing, my God is so big, so strong, and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do. So God is in heaven. We are on earth. And I think keeping that perspective is going to help us to maintain that reverence that we're supposed to have in worship and service to him. So Solomon says, do not be rash with your mouth, And let not your heart utter anything hastily or too quickly before God. He goes on, he says, therefore let your words be few. The Bible actually says quite a bit about making rash vows before God or being flippant with our lips, giving lip service to God and then doing whatever we want. Numbers 30 verse 2 says, if a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Deuteronomy 23, verse number 21 says, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. Deuteronomy 23, verse 23, a couple verses later, says, that which has gone from your lips you shall keep and perform. For you voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. There's an infamous example of someone in our Bibles who made a very brash vow, and it's found in the book of Judges, chapter 11. Do you remember Jephthah? Jephthah vowed that the first thing that came through his door he would sacrifice to God. I'm not going to get into the debate there of whether or not he kept his vow. I think that the text is very clear about that, but the story does show us how seriously it is and how seriously God views keeping vows. Verse number 3, back to Ecclesiastes 5. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. This is still in the context of what we've been talking about, and we'll talk about for a few more verses, worship. And so foolishness in worship here, foolishness in making vows, it seems slightly out of place in this verse, but I don't think it is. I think it's more of a side note that Solomon keeps talking about what he's already covered. Solomon's saying that people dream. So people dream. The implication is here inappropriate dreaming, not a good kind of dreaming, along with much activity. So in this context, bad dreaming and bad activity seems to be what he's talking about. In other words, their thoughts and actions that consume them during the day, they come out in their dreaming at night as well. We could get into a study of the subliminal mind and whatnot. You know, the mind thinks about certain things and then perhaps dreams about certain things as well. But I'm not a scientist really, so we're not going to get into that, but something to think about at least. But Solomon says a fool's voice is known by his many words. Some people just don't know when to be quiet, right? We come across people like that sometimes. It's foolishness. We need to know when it's appropriate to bite our tongues. I think of the proverb that says, answer a fool according to his folly, or don't answer a fool according to his folly, depending on the situation. We need to also remember that it's important for us to tame our tongues. James chapter 3. Even though James 3 teaches that nobody can fully tame his tongue, really. But we need to be doing our best to practice that. I think also of what Jesus says about vain repetitions. Matthew 6, verse 7, and when you pray, do not use vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. So Solomon here says, let your words be few. And Jesus in Matthew 6, verse 7 talks about many words not being a good thing when it comes to worship. So let's think carefully about that. Let's not make foolish vows to God, and let's be careful of the things that we say. Jesus in another verse says that we're going to answer for every idle word that we say on the day of judgment. Verses 4 and 5 here says, when you make a vow to God, again he gets back to that, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. This is, again, same thing Solomon's been talking about. So we'll go ahead and go to verse 6. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? Error here in the Hebrew, if you look this up, it means an inadvertent mistake. In other words, a sin of ignorance. That's actually what Hebrews 9 verse 7 is talking about when it talks about the errors of the people in the King James Version. The New King James Version perhaps translates it a little bit better when it says, "But into the second part the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance." So that idea of error there, he's talking about sins of ignorance. So we read this verse here in Ecclesiastes 5:6 again. He says, "Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God," or a prophet of God, "that it was an error." In other words, what Solomon is saying here is, don't you make a foolish vow before God and then claim, well, it was an error. It was a sin of ignorance. Solomon essentially is saying, come on, you know better than that. Everybody knows not to lie on making a vow to God. That is just the most basic of common sense, morally speaking. And so he says, just don't do that. Don't claim an error or a sin of ignorance on something like that. Why should God be angry at your excuse? Is it not the case that we often just make excuses when we really just want to do what we want to do in committing sins? So why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? Obviously, this is very serious business. Verse number 7, "For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God." Think an overactive imagination, a sense of curiosity that leads one into sin. That's, I think, what Solomon's talking about here when he says, in the multitude of dreams and many words, there is also vanity. Curiosity killed the cat. I'm fond of that expression, even when it comes to sin. Sometimes we just get curious about things, and it leads us into sin when we were better off just not thinking about those things. Sometimes people want to get as close to the line of sin as they possibly can, and they get curious about that line, and they go up to it, and they think, well, as long as I don't cross this line, I'm okay. Why in the world would you want to even get near the line? So wisdom and discernment alone should tell us as Christians, hey, we don't want anywhere near the line that takes us from not sin to sin. And I think that there's a lot of examples you could probably think of in regard to that. Sometimes people want to ask the question, modesty. Well, where's the line? Just tell me what I can get away with on modesty, and I'll do that. How about we just dress modestly and we don't try to get as close to the line as possible? Proverbs 6, verse 18, in talking about things that God hates a heart that devises wicked plans. He also hates feet that are swift in running to evil. So think about that when it comes to our curiosities that sometimes get us in trouble. Well, can I do this? I don't think that is appropriate, but maybe it's okay. Maybe I'll just play with that and see if I can get away with it. No, stay as far away as possible as you can from sin. Then you don't have to worry about getting yourself in trouble. Now, there's a couple more verses here for this week, verses 8 and 9. They were included in this section for the lectureship book, The Folly of False Religion. I think maybe they were just included because they're just two verses. They don't really go exactly with what we've been talking about, but we'll go ahead and cover them here anyway. Verse number 8, "If you see the oppression of the poor," and we talked about this a few weeks ago, injustices and things like that. "If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. For high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them." So this gets into injustices of society, mistreatment of the poor, which is a very biblical topic, by the way. The Bible talks about it a lot, actually, that we should not be mistreating the poor. Cronyism, right? Crony politics, where people are getting involved with backroom deals and things where they're looking out for their buddies and they're putting their buddies in high places. High official watches out for high official, and higher officials are over them, right? So I think we're readily familiar with this when you look at corruption in government, whether it's in D.C. or it's more local or at the state level, et cetera. But the point being that Solomon says, don't be surprised when you see that. Don't let that bring you to despair. It's just a sad reality that there's going to be corrupt people. And if you see the oppression and violent perversion of justice and righteousness, don't be surprised by that. Verse number 9, moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. This verse is perhaps a little more difficult to understand. I've looked at different meanings, different possible meanings for what this verse is saying. I think the one that makes the most sense to me is that even the king is dependent on the food that comes from the land. And so the king would be wise to not oppress the people, because if he does, then he's really just ruining his workforce. And it's just going to lead to starvation or whatnot, or lack of prosperity, even at the king's level, if he is mistreating the general population. I think that's what this is probably talking about, but you could look at just kind of a trickle-down effect, even in economics and things like that. The Bible's not an economics textbook, but it does occasionally mention things that are of economic nature, so perhaps this is a verse that would cover that. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all, and I think what is one of our national mottos or whatnot, union and justice for all, or something like that. The point being that in a just society that is not marked by oppression of the poor, there's a lot of good opportunities for all. And I think that the country where I'm living, the United States of America, it has certainly had its problems, for sure. But at the same time, this country is known for a lot of opportunities for a lot of people, if you're willing to work hard and put in the effort. And so I'm thankful for that, and I hope that that continues in this particular country. Even the king is served from the field. We might say presidents, right? Because that's what we have in the United States. But governments, basically, they need to be careful. If they're oppressing their people, then that's going to lead to a trickle-down effect even to them, as far as even the kings, presidents, or whatnot aren't going to prosper as well as they could if they're being just in how they treat their people. So this was chapter 5, the first part. Lord willing, next week we will get into verses 10 and following. That's going to be the failure of wealth to bring true happiness. Certainly a very important topic for us to consider as we continue with this theme of fear God and keep His commandments. Hope that you'll tune in next Monday for more discussion of the book of Ecclesiastes.